I'd now like to introduce three industrial speakers, Richard Retto from Amazon, James Barry from Renewable Parts, and Katrina Corey from Topolytics, to give a bit of an overview about what they're doing in relation to value retention. And this session, each of the speakers will, as I said, give an overview. There'll be time for a few questions in the chat. And then this is really to set up the workshop session that follows. And each of the speakers will be in the workshop as well to provide a bit more detail. So Richard, is it okay if I hand over to you first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Fiona. Make sure everybody can hear me. Yeah, thanks. You wanted me to cover, a part of our ambition, what we're doing, and I'm going to focus a little bit on how to measure circularity. It's a key sort of area for us in terms of finding that metric and then be able to scale it across all of our business, because what gets measured gets managed, and without it, it's very difficult to persuade leadership and the various innovation on the product side, on the tech side, to be able to make the right decisions. So it's super important. So I'm a director for circular economy for Europe, for Amazon, as Fiona said. Circular economy in our business is pretty much focused on material innovation, new designs of products and tech, zero landfill, better recycling, and circular business model innovation. By the way, I'm not going to use some slides. I'm just going to speak to you directly, because I think I'm much more comfortable in doing that. So let's talk a little bit about measuring circularity. So at the end of 2020, we undertook a project to identify what metrics are out there. And as you all probably know, there's many metrics. We wanted to be able to measure it, to set goals, measure progress, drive across the business. So it's a really key part of our culture and other similar companies. And we wanted to use it also, as I said, to guide the business, to really sort of drive the right behaviors, to allow them to make the right decisions. So when we look at planning, when we look at new products, when we look at packaging, that we only just look at the normal financial and cost and productivity measures, but we also look at the various sustainability metrics, whether it be carbon, whether it be material circularity, social responsibility, all of those metrics, and how we bring that all together. So on the circularity side, the team identified the MCI, the Material Circularity Indicator from the Ellen MacArthur, and we thought it would be the right metric for our use case. So we planned to use this metric and sort of combine it with carbon emissions, develop a product-specific scorecard, particularly for our retail business, where we have a very large selection. And so we decided we'd pilot that. And so we partnered with a part of our business to get the bill of materials for a representative sample across the various product groups that we had. So, what did we find? So the last 6 months, we've spent a long time trying to go for the right level of detail on the bill of materials, the level 3, the level 4s, levels to be able to make for our representative samples, to see what we could learn and what we could scale. And also to combine that with carbon, because the idea is we won't pursue circularity at the expense of carbon. So we wanted to be able to find a way to balance that off. So what was the good news? The good news was the business teams have been super enthusiastic about the insights, both the material choices and the strategy decisions. We've completed a number of pilots quite successfully, an evaluation of an HDPE film, a flexible PET nylon PE pouch, HDPE bottle, a gable top carton. We looked at a biodegradable plastic for packaging, and we looked at for a weather protection bag, whether we should do a plastic, a paper, or the bioplastic, or recyclable paper options. And so we pretty much engaged with 8 teams across the world and about 50 scores in trying to learn what we wanted. So in each case, we spark conversations. I don't think what we've been able to answer is how we help to make those decisions. So if we have a cent per unit more expensive in packaging, how do you reconcile that with a sort of point, you know, a 0.1 improvement in circularity. And I think that's one of the big elements that we'll need to learn and understand. But one of the biggest challenges we found was actually getting access to that level of detail of bill of materials. As you're probably aware, the selection in our retail business is really large. In fact, it wouldn't surprise you, but it's tens of millions of products that we have. So the key thing is, how do we scale that? And we found that a significant obstacle. The vendors and sellers were also reluctant, despite the offer of incentives, to share it with us. So we found that a major barrier. The second barrier was the end of life intelligence data. So effectively, what's recycled, what's reused, what's composted, what's incinerated, what's landfilled for the different materials in each of the sort of municipalities or councils or areas. And finding that data was super tough. In fact, when we looked in the US, the only data we found was actually from 2018. And also it wasn't at the right level 3 level material level, and nor was it down at the level of municipalities. And so across about 3 of the different sort of angles, we found it sadly lacking. So we are trying to move it. We are committed to try and measure circularity, but what we're trying to work through now is what sort of elements we can do in the short term. And I think, as I saw in several of the presentations earlier, from the 50 pilots we've done, we found the obvious themes across our products in terms of reduce the mass of a product, improve the recycled content, improve the recyclability, improve the durability or longevity of the product. And so we're trying to take some of those themes, try to figure out how we're able to scale and manage that and measure it with the teams. Meanwhile, the science teams will work on how we're able to really get ahead and scale on measuring circularity. A colleague of mine, Alan Jacobson, will join for the second part of this session in terms of the breakout rooms and things. He's a scientist, a material scientist with our science team, so hopefully he can go into a little bit more detail in this area. But I just wanted to share some of the progress, the ambition that we had, and some of the challenges, particularly in measuring this, because for us in particular, not being able to measure it is a huge obstacle for our progress.
Great, thanks ever so much, Richard. And it's really exciting to see or to hear about some of the stuff that Amazon is doing, particularly in relation to your size and scale and potential impacts. And I think, measuring and metrics we've found to be a really critical area. If you've got any questions for Rich, please pop them in the chat, and we'll put them to him once we've heard from our other 2 speakers. So I'm now going to hand over to James Barry from Renewable Parts.
Thank you, Fiona. I appreciate that. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you all about circular economy, something I spend a lot of time talking about. Just as a little bit of a background, I spent 25 years of my career in aerospace, and in that time learned a lot about MRO. And MRO is fundamentally refurbishing gas turbine engines for aircraft. And it's quite an interesting statistic to note that 80% of an aircraft engine is refurbished. And when you think that safety is the #1 consideration in aviation, it tells you that it can be done in all industries, and it needs to read across faster. So I'm minded by that, and that's where I sort of cut my teeth on this. So I'm a relative newbie to renewables. I've been here for 6 years. Our business is supply chain and logistics and parts, but increasingly remanufacture and refurbishment. And we're working hard to try and change the shape of the industry and procurement practices within the wind industry. So I'll talk a little bit about that today and some of the experiences we've had and the reality of some of the human behaviors that exist within it, and the shifting in thinking that we need to drive if we're going to become truly circular. So next slide, please. So I use slides to provoke reaction from people, and this is one I use quite frequently in customer conversations. And the first question that comes back from customers is typically, please tell me that wasn't my wind turbine site. And of course, we don't really reveal who it is, but it could have been taken at any wind turbine site or any dock for that matter for parts coming back on shore from offshore turbines. The uncomfortable truth is that the wind industry is a green energy source, but the behaviors in the supply chain, in the aftermarket specifically here, are anything but green. Refurbishment does occur, but typically is restricted to very large components like gearboxes and generators. And the bill of material, i.e. all the parts in the wind turbine, the minor corrective parts, barely get touched. So my business is focusing on how do we address that and how do we go after it by applying new technology. The good news is that everyone's committing themselves to a net carbon future, and decarbonizing supply chains now is a phrase that's frequently used. I think if you asked a lot of businesses in the wind industry, what is their plan for the supply chain, there would be a pause. And I think where we are at this point in time is that I almost liken it saying, we're going to the moon by the end of the decade. Don't know how we're going to get to the moon, but we're going there, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that's similar to where we are in the wind industry. So boardrooms up and down the country have committed themselves to this, and now they're trying to formulate a plan of how they get there. And that's fine. I know we're a young industry, we're growing fast. The engineering resource has been focused on new technology, ever bigger turbines. Thinking about the aftermarket and supply chain and waste, like the picture you see here, has been secondary, but it's fast coming up on the outside. So this is all about how do we embed sustainable practices, sustainable thinking, how do we go faster? We've made a start as a business, but we have so much more to do. Next slide, please. So some of this is rhetorical, but you can get the understanding that today the procurement practices largely within the wind industry are linear. And it is a fit once, dispose philosophy. And really what we're trying to do here is disrupt and change that behavior, that procurement strategy. There is still a very high focus on price and lead time. I am now being asked more frequently about, is there a sustainable option available? And I know when our job is done, when the first question from a procurement team in a business is, where is the sustainable option? So we're moving towards that. And we believe that that's going to start accelerating over the next few years. It is about culture. There's no question about this. It's about how do you shift the behaviors which are hard ingrained in those businesses. That is starting to come from shareholders, institutional investors. If the business has committed itself to a net carbon future, then how does it go about doing that? And that is the questions, those are the questions that are now starting to arrive. I feel we're at a tipping point here. But one thing we do need to understand is the business models of big business. And if you take a manufacturer like Siemens Gamesa, they make a turbine, the turbine is installed for 30 years, and they have an aftermarket stream of selling new parts. So moving to refurbishment or remanufacture presents a new challenge for them. And how do they do that and balance the business model and the sense that no longer they're going to sell new parts, but they're going to sell something different. I also feel there's very much an ingrained behavior of change. People are resistant to change and status quo and keep turning that handle. And, you know, I've used the old adage, no one got fired for buying IBM, but it's a true, you know, it's a truism. And I see that, and I see fear, and I see uncertainty, and I see, well, we can't do that because it's unproven. And it's almost the analogy of a new car is better than a used car. Well, that's actually a fairly crude analogy, and it's not actually true when you think about the new technology we have. Next slide, please. So if you look at the wind turbine industry today and you look at the actual breakdown of cost, you know, you can see on the left-hand side, this is the big area of blades and towers. Those things are not replaced. They are fit once for life. And then you have 47%, which is the replaced components. And then when you break that down, you have areas like gearbox, which is dominating here, 27%. But this area of 47% on the right-hand side, minor components, barely touched. There are no businesses in the UK who are refurbishing parts of wind turbines as a specialism, apart from ourselves, which I find extraordinary. And I expect most days when I wake up to read about someone else emerging and coming up on the outside. But fundamentally, we need to move faster. We need to invest more quickly. We need to be bolder. And we need to get people moving from where they are today on linear procurement to circular procurement, alongside linear strategies as well. Next slide, please. So the life cycle of a wind turbine is 25 years. In actual fact, most asset owners will expect 30 years and even longer. And the truth is that we are still a very young industry and maturing fast, but the focus has been on buying ever bigger turbines and ever more turbines. And it's not about how do you start to address what we call legacy turbines, those turbines which are only at half-life, and start to drive into them strategies and practices that reduce the waste and all those parts that get consumed during the life cycle. How do you receive those parts, inspect those parts, drive through the R&D, and actually provide sustainable solutions to customers so they have an alternative option? And that really is, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do. Our innovation partner is the University of Strathclyde. In my view, they are the MIT of the UK in terms of applied technology in renewables. They are outstanding in what they do. And they've allowed us to move forward dramatically in terms of deploying solutions into the market that are rigorously tested and that have an enormous amount of due diligence, engineering due diligence behind them. But the diagram here really is just trying to illustrate that there are different phases in the life of a wind turbine. And depending on where you're at, the strategies that you employ will differ. But during this whole period, many, many parts are being replaced. And it's not uncommon for a part to be replaced 4, 5, 6 times during the life of a turbine. And at the moment, they're all being scrapped, typically. Next slide, please. So this is quite interesting in terms of the economics of new versus remanufacture. When I was in aerospace, typically the price of a new part was a significant markup on the manufacturing cost. That is a generic illustration, but it's not far from the truth. As you bring in remanufacture options, which are less than catalog price of new, you can see the disruptor effect on the OEMs and how they need to revisit this. So there is an embedded challenge here that we're having to overcome as well, as how people reset their business models and accommodate a sustainable future where remanufacture and reuse becomes the norm, as opposed to just keep making and selling new at full markup. We were talking a little bit earlier about measurement, and I absolutely agree on measurement. You get what you measure. Every component that leaves our business now has a sustainability sticker on it, measured in kilograms, and basically it's offset. It's really what we're saying is, by not manufacturing 150 kilograms of steel, you're generating about 300 kg of carbon footprint reduction. So this is about the avoidance of virgin manufacture. So basically we're able to describe to our customers, depending on what they're buying and what materials in it, what that carbon footprint reduction effect is. So that's one thing. The second thing that we're using is a circular economy index. We know what customers spend on parts per turbine per annum. And by expressing how many parts they buy, which are reused or remanufactured, we can create an index. So we are starting to monitor customers and behavior very closely. And really what we want to do is increase that index of customers upwards. And I see no reason at all why that index can't be 50 or more. 50% of those parts, those minor corrective parts they buy, being reused or remanufactured. So that's a pretty quick trot through what our experiences are. Got started, pretty pleased with where we are. A heck of a lot to get done, but I think we really are at an inflection point, and we're going to see a massive acceleration of reuse and remanufacture within the wind industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Wow, some really interesting figures there, and a huge opportunity for remanufacturing. Just amazed that you're the only ones doing it at the moment. But yeah, it's exciting. And anyone that wants to know more about renewable parts, we did publish a story a few weeks ago on the CE Hub website. So please go there, and I'm sure James will be happy to hear from you as well. There's a couple of questions, James, but I'm going to let Catriona speak, and then perhaps we'll come back to answer those questions just at the end. So I'd like to now introduce Katrina Corey from Topolytics.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so hopefully you'll get that up in a second. Is everyone okay to see that now?
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Fiona. So yes, I'm the lead waste analyst at Topolytics, which is a startup in Edinburgh. prior to that, I worked at Mighty Waste and Environmental and Veolia, so I've got a bit of experience in the kind of the sharp end at the waste side of the industry. So if I move on, there we go. So Topolytics its main aim is to make the world's waste visible through data and geospatial mapping, as well as verifiable and valuable. So the discussions around about data and the challenges of what's measurable is very, very appropriate, I think. And our mission is to try and substantially improve the commercial and environmental outcomes for the world's waste and resources. And how we're planning to do that, well, really, we're looking at the problem. One of the things I think when we talk about waste, we kind of boil a lot of complex kind of conversations down to one entity called waste, whereas actually the vast myriad of products and materials that go in to become waste all require individual solutions and applications to be able to extract the resource or get the value back in. So you end up with this kind of complex infrastructure surrounding waste, which you can kind of see a bit of we've done a bit of a tube map kind of view of this to kind of give you a bit of a flavour, but the reality is probably a lot more complex, and this doesn't cover kind of the geographical elements where these different components could be within your locale, it could be within your region, it could be within the same country, or it might be actually in another country where your waste is actually getting handled, because waste is a global enterprise. And because it's so complex and because there's so many different parts of that waste chain, there can be a limited level of visibility into what actually happens, and therefore also a little bit of lack of trust that from waste producer going, do you really understand where your waste goes? You have confidence in what your waste partners and what they're doing with their waste to make sure that it's being handled in a safe and compliant way. Coupled with that, there's a challenge around about how data is collected and provided. It can be excellent in some respects and can be terrible as well in other spaces. So it means that variance in quality can make it quite challenging in terms of trying to work out how to maximise resource recovery and get the value out of your waste supply chain. And what does that matter? So we've obviously, it's had a huge factor in terms of the circular economy. We can't really have a circular system without really knowing where we can get hold of those secondary materials, being able to, reduce waste in the first place, look at repair, refurbishment and, minimization initiatives. So being able to really explore and understand resources and map that properly really is a key component of the circular economy, I think. And part of that then feeds into the net zero kind of aspect as well, because by ensuring materials remain in circulation, products remain in circulation, you're driving down your emissions. And although, we've had COP26 recently and energy was the kind of main headliner in that, rightfully, that so much of carbon emissions sit within scope 3, that not assessing what happens within your material supply chain will ultimately mean that we'll probably be unlikely to meet our net zero commitments if we don't consider that. And lastly, we've got our regulatory pressure. And from that perspective, we've got various instruments coming in from a government perspective around about things like, banning single-use plastics, extended producer responsibility. We've also had our Environment Act come through Parliament this week as well. And we've got activities such as deposit return that are coming down the pipeline soon as well. That it's going to change and continually change how the waste and resource landscape looks. So where Topolytics comes into it, we've developed a platform that takes in the data elements from the waste side and puts it into a software platform in order to try and look at how we can improve operationally, how operationally effective systems are for waste producers, identify potential opportunities for secondary waste markets or secondary material markets, allow recyclers and brokers to look at what suppliers are available in an area to be able to either move on secondary materials or even look at new customers and new opportunities to provide services. And then sitting at that helicopter view of looking how waste moves around a country or a particular locale or globally will allow governments and cities to be able to set regulatory policy and control regulation around it. So what we do, we've taken data from a number of different sources. We take it from our customers, we take it from publicly accessible databases, satellite imagery, sensors. In fact, if you give us any data, we'll try and put it in somehow to make it work to further enhance our mapping. And we feed that into our data lake on the back end, which allows us to set up modelling normalize the data, aggregate it, and start to create trends and predict what's happening to waste and where waste and resources are moving. And that allows us to look at things like, well, where waste is moving to, what types of waste is moving, which allows us to feed into things like environmental reporting, support enhanced assurance around about duty of care, and then feed into capturing those waste miles, that the waste logistics elements from where waste moves from producer site through that chain of all the different sites that waste moved to before it reaches its end disposal or recovery point, and then calculate the carbon on the back end of that. So just to kind of summarise, just at the end, just giving a couple of snapshots from Waste Map in this screen here. So you can see basically we can look at, on the platform, you can look at your waste movements from a granular perspective, looking at those compliance gaps, or looking at where your sites are located in terms of the movements from A to B, or I say, moving out and looking at that regulatory level, looking at the extent of where waste is moving to and where kind of hotspots sit. So that's Topolytics in a nutshell. I'm happy to take any questions and looking forward to the workshops later. Thank you.
Thank you, Catriona. That was really interesting, and yeah, addressing another really important challenge of kind of lack of data, particularly around waste and where it ends up. We've got a few questions that have come in. So we've got a group of questions around kind of social responsibility, overconsumption. So Shamil asked earlier, how can social responsibility amongst citizens be influenced through circular economy? And Joe has asked a question that I think is directed mainly at Richard, asking how you're working to address the overconsumption of your consumers.
That's a good question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah, it's a great question. I think we're looking at all of those sort of levers across the different elements of our business model. One of them, of course, itself is even upstream, which is looking at the overstock or excess stock. And it is one of those elements. Most of the planning systems across the supply chain, not just Amazon, but in other companies, is all built on customer service levels, which are 95, 96, 97%, which of course encourages overstock. And that encourages, discounting, promotions, which of course distorts the real sort of consumption patterns. So yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we have the answer, but the one thing that we are trying to get more involved in is a sort of industry coalition with various other retailers and other branded consumer goods companies to sort of work through and understand how we can be a lot more responsible in terms of the production upstream, how we then forecast it, and then the use of consumer promotions, which are, as everybody aware, completely distorts the market and causes mass overconsumption. So yeah, it's a recognized problem. We need to work together to sort it. And we at least recognize it, which I think is a good first step, but lots more to do for sure.
Great, thank you. And perhaps we can pick up on some of this in the workshop, because Debbie had a follow-on question around reverse logistics, but I think we'll leave that to the workshop if that's okay. Sure. And then there was a question for James around the use of rare earth metals in turbines, and yeah, the shock that why is no one interested in recovering these precious materials?
I think the answer is they are, but I think it's tricky. It's involved process. There's a lot of work going on, particularly by the OEMs, to try and understand how they can, whether it be, you've obviously read about blades, but various other components, and retrieve those rare earth metals. That is starting to gather pace. I think you're going to see that emerging quite dramatically over the next 2 to 3 years. I think the challenge in the wind industry is one of engineering resource. Everyone will have noticed how much renewables is growing and the speed of the growth. The industrial challenge for the wind industry over the next decade and beyond is off the scale. It is absolutely mind-boggling how much has to be done. And I'm afraid the engineers are all focused on new technology, ever bigger turbines, and the capacity to build this out. And I think downstream in the aftermarket has, I'm afraid, had to take a bit of a back seat. It will start to rebalance, but that is where we are at the moment. We're talking about a 10-fold increase in capacity over the next 10 to 20 years in offshore, which is just just mind-boggling.
Right, thank you very much. Great, well, thank you for your insights. As I said, we're now going to move into a workshop session where each of the speakers will be available to discuss this further.